How do we say this with our actions? Well, I'll give you very practical examples. How do we say I love my job more than Allah? Well, when I see that I'm going to make more profit by selling alcohol, I go ahead and sell alcohol. If I see that I'm going to make more profit by taking an interest, or dealing an interest or taking an interest-bearing loan, I do it. Because in my heart, what do I love more? If I see, for example, one of the things is our homes. One of it is our homes. If I see that it's more important to me that I have a big, humongous, fancy house that people can look at and say, look at that person's house, and my image is more important than my love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then I'm going to choose that route. My car. In the Quran, one of the things in Surah Al-Imran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبِّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ وَالْبَنِينَ وَالْقَنَاطِيرِ الْمُقَنطَرَةِ. Now in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lists many things that are that decorate our dunya. And among those things is well-branded horses and stuff. And here, it used to be horses, the branded horses. Now it's Mercedes and BMWs because it's just a different type of ride. But it's that branded ride. So these are the things Allah is mentioning in the Quran, that these are the things that decorate our dunya. But these are not the things that matter. These are just, when something is decoration. Like if you look in this room, there's the walls, there's the bricks, there's the floor, the ground, and the ceiling, and then there's these lights. And the lights are really insignificant because they're just there for decoration. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes the dunya in that, using that same term, zina, zuyyina. It's just decoration. It's not actually the substance. It's not actually what matters. So why it becomes very difficult is because it is within these halal things. It's not like, well, we know, okay, having a haram relationship, dating, okay, this is haram, right? We don't date, we don't have a girlfriend, we don't have a boyfriend. But what about when it's your spouse? Now it becomes much more hidden that I actually love my spouse more than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It becomes much more hidden that I actually love my father or my mother more than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or as I should love Allah. Or my children. This is a big test. Because how do I love my children more than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, I might say, well, really, I'm very concerned about my children's future. Let me set up a savings account for them. And this savings account is interest-bearing. But my concern and my love and my fear for protecting my children is greater than my fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for dealing in interest. So you understand how we don't need to speak it with our tongue, but in our actions we really do love other things as we should only love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So a heart that is salim is a heart that's free of these things. It's a heart that loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger and striving in His cause more than everything else. Even the halal things that we legitimately love. That's what's so interesting about this ayah that describes and lists these things, is all of them are legitimately loved. Our fathers, our children, our spouses, our jobs, all of them are halal and it's legitimate to love. But the problem is when we love these things as we should love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is where we get into the concept of attachments. Attachments are things that I depend upon as I should only depend on Allah. They're things that, how do you know that you have an attachment to something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or something is taking that spot that only Allah should have? One question you can ask yourself is, what occupies my mind most? What is on my mind most of the day? What am I most consumed with? Probably most people in this room, it's going to be school, right? I mean, this is true. And this is the point, is what happens is, school, again, legitimate, right? It's a legitimate cause, and inshallah it can be, a good cause, in fact. But the problem is when we turn the means into the end. The problem is when we turn the means into the end. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, if I'm trying to get back to Orange County is my end, it's my goal. And then my means, the way that I'm going to get there is my car. Okay? So that's means and end, right? Now the problem is, I don't get anywhere when I turn my car into my end. Okay, so now I've switched things around, and now my car becomes my goal. So now what's going to happen is I'm going to get in my car and I'm not going to go anywhere because I've turned it into the goal itself. If we enter into education, for example, and education is supposed to be a means or an end? A means, right? What's the end? The end is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is our ultimate end in everything that we do? It should be Allah. Our problem begins when we don't realize and we put other things as our end. When we put other things as our goal other than Allah, that's when we suffer. That's when we fall. That's when we get into trouble. So in this case, if school is our end, what happens after? What happens after I graduate? What happens after I graduate? What happens for some people after they graduate is they actually go into sort of depression or something. And what happens basically is I lived my whole life for this. It consumed my life. It almost became my goal, right? It became my goal. And then now what? And it's this concept of now what? When you make something temporary your goal, and then once you get there, then you fall into sort of this drop, this disillusionment, this now what? Because it was never the goal itself. It should have been the means. It should have been the vehicle, the car in this case. And if you use everything in your life as that means, as that goal, as that car to take you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then everything, assuming it's halal and according to sunnah, can be blessed. And everything can actually be a worship for you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I have not created jinn and human beings except for one purpose. We live for a lot of purposes, unfortunately. But Allah is saying that this is our actual purpose, is the reason why He created us, is to worship Him, is to fulfill ubudiyyah to Allah. And so if we're not fulfilling that purpose, we're always going to suffer. We're never going to be satisfied, and we're always going to suffer because we're not actually, it's kind of like you have a certain appliance and you're not using it for what it was intended for. Okay? You can't take a blender and expect to cook things in it, right? It has a particular purpose. If you don't use that tool the way that it was created to be used, it's going to do a couple things. One, it's going to break, right? And second, it's not going to work properly. The human being, if the human being isn't doing if the human being is not living for the purpose for which it was created, it's going to break and it's not going to work properly. And that's why we as human beings, we fall into this where we're not working properly, right? There's something wrong. And the human heart itself was created for only one purpose. It was only created to know and love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was not created for any other purpose. When we use the human heart for other than that purpose, that's why the heart breaks. That's why the heart becomes empty, and that's why it doesn't work properly. You can't take a car and fill it up. Every human being basically has sort of this hole inside of them. And that hole can only be filled with one thing. That hole can only be filled with being close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's nothing else that can fill that hole. But the problem with us, and this is an overall human problem, is we try to fill that hole with other things. And this is something that every person, Muslim, non-Muslim, Christian, whoever, is trying to fill this hole because every human being has it. It's that need for something. And so people try to fill it with different things, and everyone kind of uses different things to try to fill it. Some people try to fill it with their jobs, some try to fill it with money, some try to fill it with status, some try to fill it with physical pleasure, some try to fill it with alcohol, drugs. You're trying to fill it. You're trying to escape the fact that you fill this hole. But when you try to fill it with something that it was never meant to be filled with, it breaks. It doesn't work. It's like taking a car and saying, my car is empty. You see the gas light and you say, okay, I have some orange juice in the back. Right? You're taking orange juice and you put it in the gas. What's it going to do? What's going to happen to your car? First of all, is your car going to move? No. And second of all, what do you do to the car? You're actually destroying the car because you're filling it with the wrong thing. And the heart is the same way. When you fill the heart with the wrong thing, you're actually destroying the heart, and it's not able to function properly. So what I want to do, inshallah, is give some sort of practical, what I would say, sort of steps or recipes of how to have basically be ultimately successful in our path in this life and the next. Because we're all on a journey, right? We all know we started out, we were born. Everybody was born in this room, right? Everybody was born at one point, and everybody's going to die, right? Any arguments there? Nobody can argue with that. These are two certainties. You were born and you're going to die. And nobody, no matter how skeptical you are, no matter what religion you believe in, can argue with those two truths, right? So the point is we're going on a journey. We're going somewhere and we're going to die one day. And by the way, the Prophet ﷺ actually has recommended this as a way to, he has actually advised us to remember our death, to remember that we are going to die. Because if you think about, if you remember that you're going to leave this place, you completely live differently. You will live completely differently. The person who thinks that they're going to live here forever, who doesn't remember their death, is very attached to this life and will want to maximize sort of physical pleasure or momentary pleasure because they don't think that they're leaving. You know, one of the examples that sort of drives this point home is if you think about a traveler. A traveler, when you go, so you guys, actually this works in your case, as students. A lot of you guys are living, or all of you basically, are living in temporary housing. You're living in dorms or you're living in apartments that you know you're not staying in. So let me ask you this question. How much effort do you guys put into decorating your dorm room, your apartment? How much effort do you put into getting like the most expensive furniture, the most expensive carpets? How much? Zero, right? Okay, good. How many like paintings did you put on the wall? You guys okay, other than you. Okay, so you guys get my point. Why do you do that? Now compare that to someone who's like feels that they're very settled in their house. They just bought a new house and they think they're going to live there, for the rest of their life. How does their house look different than your dorm or your apartment? You guys feel me? Like the difference in night and day, right? Like your furniture, mashallah, very humble, and you don't care. You don't care. But you wouldn't want that for your permanent house. Am I right? Right? Okay, so there's a certain mentality. There's a certain mentality when you know that you're staying somewhere temporarily. You know that you're leaving. You don't get so attached. I mean, how many of you are like super duper attached to your dorm room? Anyone? No. You guys, you see that? The reason you're not is because you know, I'm leaving this place. I'm leaving this place very soon. So I'm not going to get attached to it. This is the mentality we should have in dunya, in this life. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharib." Be in this life as if you're a stranger or a traveler. Because when you feel that way, when you feel that you are traveling, and you remember, and he tells us to remember death, when you feel that way, you naturally are not attached to that place. And you'll take from it what you need. Yeah, and you take what you need from your university. You take what you need from your dorm and your apartment, but you're not attached to it. If someone comes and says you have to get up and move, it's easy for you. It's easy for you to leave your dorm, am I right? And sometimes you guys have to leave, like you have to move to different places, different years, right? Does it hurt anybody? Anybody here get hurt about that? It's easy, right? But when someone comes and tells you you have to leave your house, some people get very hurt by that. Do you understand the attachment? Because the idea was, no, I was going to stay here. I thought I was going to stay here. Versus I knew I was leaving. Completely different mentality in how you interact with that place and how you are in that place. So our mentality in this dunya should be that I'm leaving this place. This place is temporary, and the place that I'm going to is not temporary. The place that I'm actually preparing for is the one that lasts. This one does not last. Nothing in this life lasts. And this is a sign for us. Even the fact that when you see a flower or you see any kind of plant or garden, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it a sign that it doesn't last. Do you guys ever think about this? Because this is something Allah is telling us in the Quran to think about. That look at these things, that no matter how beautiful the flower is, it only lasts for a limited amount of time. And over time, no matter how beautiful it started, come 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, what does it do? It wilts, and then it dries up, and you can, at some point, you can just take it in your hand and just crumble it. It's nothing. And it just blows in the wind. This is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, this is the example of this life. This life is just like that plant, just like that garden. That for a while it's very beautiful and you feel very happy about it, but then it withers away. And what's left, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say is left? Either Jannah or Jahannam. That's what's left. So this is how we have to understand this life. And we need to seek, look at around the signs around us, they teach us about these things, that nothing here lasts. Another example is our youth. Like you guys, you don't feel this because you are all young right now, yeah? But if I were talking to a room of 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, they would feel what I was saying. Like, I was young like yesterday, man. Where did it go? But even if you think about when you were in middle school, it doesn't seem like it was that far away. The point is that no matter how youthful someone is or how beautiful someone is at some point in their life, what happens? Take the most attractive superstar, or movie star. But what happens after 10, 20, 30 years to them? Nobody, no matter how much plastic surgery they, try to do, nobody will look the same. Over time, you lose that beauty. And this is the sunnah of this life, that everything passes away except for one thing, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only thing that's lasting. So what we have to do is be careful not to hold on to what's passing away. And we need to hold on to what's lasting. And we need to prepare for what's lasting. Because it's just a foolish person who sits and puts all of the furniture, it's like, imagine that you know that you're moving to another house. And you sit and you take all the furniture from that house you're moving into and you put it in your dorm that you're leaving. It wouldn't make any logical sense, right? What we do, we take from our akhirah, the house that we're going to, and we fill our dunya, which is the house we're leaving, the dorm that we're leaving. We need to really that's a foolish thing to do. Because we know that we're leaving this life and we're going to the next. So furnish the next life. Because that's the life you're going to, and that's the one that lasts. Okay? So I'm going to, inshallah, go through, this is what I would say, so 10-step recipe for success, inshallah, in this path to our final home, inshallah. The first one is what I talked about for a little bit, and that is know what your goal is. You need to know where you're going. If you're in a race and you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. You need to know what your goal is. It has to be very clear in your mind. And here, the goal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So know Allah. Know who Allah is. Know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you. Now, the second one, now that you know your goal, second, know your purpose with respect to the goal. This is also very important. If you're going to fulfill this purpose, you need to know what it is. And in our case, and in the case of the human being and all of creation, is that purpose is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you know this, then you can better prepare and you can better fulfill your purpose. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created jinn and human beings except to worship me. So basically, number 1 defines your end, and number 2 defines your means. How are you going to get there? How are you going to get to Allah? Through ubudiyyah, through worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the question here, this doesn't mean, again, just a side note, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just mean something you do at Friday Jum'ah, right? It's not just when you're praying. It's not just in Ramadan. We said that worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using any means that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to get closer to Him. That's worship. So if I'm using my schooling, my education for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's a form of ibadah. That's a form of worship. And we know that everything can potentially be worshipped because Allah says that's the only reason He created us, which means that for sure it's something we could do at every moment because He says that's our only purpose. Number 3, know this life. Know this life. If you're going to be able to sort of master the dunya, you guys ever seen The Matrix? You guys know The Matrix? Okay. So how does he, what's his name? Neo. That's what I thought.
How did you forget his name?
Yeah, no, I was thinking Leo for a second, then I thought Neo. Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyway, how does Neo break out of the Matrix? He has to, in order to break out of the Matrix, he has to understand the Matrix. He has to master, the way to master the Matrix is to understand it. If you want to break out of dunya, you're going to be in dunya, but you know how to master dunya, you have to understand dunya. So what are the characteristics of dunya? First of all, dunya is temporary. You have to understand that, or you'll get lost in it. If you don't understand that this dunya is temporary, that it has a beginning and it will have an end, you will get lost in it. You will get drowned in it. And this is the concept we talked about with the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, be in this life as if you're a traveler or a stranger. Second aspect of dunya, that this life is imperfect. This life, dunya, was never intended or designed to be perfect. The perfect life is in Jannah, inshallah. This life is imperfect by design and by its very nature. To expect this life to be perfect, again, you're gonna get sucked in. You're gonna get damaged by it. You're gonna get hurt by it. Because if you expect something to be perfect and it's not perfect, you're gonna be disappointed again and again and again. So knowing that this dunya is imperfect. The only life that is perfect in the sense of complete is the hereafter. And that means actually that the hereafter is perfectly good or perfectly bad. Right? You know how whenever we're in this life, think about the absolute best time of your life, the best period in your life, or even the best moment in your life. Think about it for a second. Now, let me ask you this. During that time, was every single thing perfect? Or was there something, always something that isn't perfect? Right? Okay. Now think about the hardest time in your life. The worst, most difficult period in your life. Now let me ask you this. You might have felt at the moment that everything was horrible, right? But was it really? Or was there any possible good in your life at that time? Your mom was still healthy, your kids were, your relatives were still healthy, you were still healthy, right? There was something. Even during that time, while you felt like everything was really bad. So what's my point? My point is that in this life, inna ma'al usri yusra, that with hardship comes ease. So you always have a mix at every point in life. It's always a mix of both good and bad. You never have all good and you never have all bad. Do you guys feel me? So no matter how bad it gets, it's not all bad. No matter how good it gets, it's not all good. This is dunya. This is not hereafter. Hereafter is all good or all bad. There's no ease in Jahannam. There's no ease in Jahannam. A'udhu billah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for protection from that place because there's no ease. This life, we can always say, oh, that thing was so hard, or that time in my life was like this or that. But there's still ease in this life, no matter how bad it gets. That's not the case for hellfire. That's not the case for Jahannam. Similarly, in Jannah, there is no hardship in Jannah. No matter how good it gets here, there's always something that's hard. There's something that's imperfect. That's not the case in Jannah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes Jannah, لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. There is no khawf in Jannah, there's no fear in Jannah, and no sadness, no sorrow. If you think about the two emotions in this life which torture people most, what is it? It's fear and it's sadness. It's depression and it's anxiety. Some form of it. Those are the two that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again and again in the Quran explains that there's none of that in Jannah. Those two specifically, khawf and sadness, hazan. Okay, those are the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we don't have in Jannah. Okay, third aspect of dunya. To understand dunya in order to master it is that this life is a test. You cannot succeed if you don't know it's a test. I might give you, your professor might give you a piece of paper, and if you think that you're just supposed to doodle on there, that's one thing, right? But if he tells you, dude, this is your test, in fact, this is your final exam, you're going to perform a little differently, right? Than if it's just a scrap piece of paper, okay? If people go through this life and think it's just a scrap piece of paper, they don't do very well. They think that everything has no purpose, nobody's watching them, you just do whatever you want, you just doodle on that paper. So then they don't perform very well. But if you know that this life is a test, you were handed that final exam and your professor is going to grade it, you're going to do a lot differently. You're going to act a lot differently. You're going to do a lot better. So if Allah has told us, in Surah Al-Mulk, for example, تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. He says that He is the one who created death and life in order to test you, which of you are best in deeds. So if you thought there was any other reason why He created life and death, there isn't. This is the reason. This is the reason. This is the reason, you guys, that we are on this earth. The reason why He created life and death is to test us which of us are best in deeds. So if we know that, we're going to respond much, much differently. We know we're being watched. You know you're being judged. You're in a competition, really. And all of us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَسَارِعُوا إِلَى مَغْفِرَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَجَنَّاتٍ عَرْضُهَا كَعَرْضِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, race to forgiveness from Allah, from your Lord, and Jannah, whose expanse is like the heavens and the earth. Allah is telling us to compete, to race. So we are in a competition. And there is a judge, and that judge is always watching. Allah is always watching. So He's going to judge, He is judging how we respond, how we act to everything coming our way. Everything is a test. Everything that happens to you is a test. Everything that doesn't happen is a test. The whole thing is a test. Lastly, number 4, in the understanding dunya, is knowing how to succeed in this life, how to stay afloat in the ocean of dunya. Now, if you think about dunya as an ocean, if you go into the ocean with a boat, what happens if the boat lets the water in?
You sink.
You start to sink, right? Now, if you think about this life, the dunya, as an ocean, and think about the boat as your heart. As long as that boat stays on top of the water, on top of the dunya, on top of the ocean, and doesn't let the water in, it's fine. It stays floating and it's okay. But as soon as that boat allows water into it, that's when it sinks. And this is the same way with dunya. As soon as we let dunya into our hearts, and we start to become attached to dunya, and we start to love dunya, and dunya no longer is a means. Remember, we talked about the difference between means and end. When you make dunya your end, you will sink. It's just like a person who says, the ocean is my end. What's going to happen to you if the ocean, where are you going? The ocean. That's where I'm going. That's my goal. If that's your end, you're going to sink. But if you use the ocean as a means, actually I'm just passing through. I'm just passing through the ocean to get to the next continent, right? To get to the next place. That's how dunya is. We're just passing through it to get to the next place. But if we make it our end, we let it into our hearts, that's when we sink. Okay, number 4 in this recipe for success in this life and the next is plan for tomorrow. So as students, you guys think a lot about your future. It's natural. You think about, what am I going to do next year? What am I going to do after I graduate? What am I going to do with my career? These are all things that you think about. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا ربكم ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins this ayah by telling us to have fear of Him. So Allah is addressing here those who believe. Allah addresses different people in the Quran. In this case, He's addressing the believers and He says, have taqwa of Allah, have fear of Allah. First advice. Second advice, وَلْتَنْظُرْ نَفْسٌ مَا قَدَّمَتْ لِغَدٍ. And let every nafs, every human being, every soul know what it has set forth for tomorrow. In this case, tomorrow, capital T. So we all spend our, so much time planning on tomorrow. Tomorrow as in, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, next year, after I graduate. Allah here is telling us and reminding us, plan for the other tomorrow, the tomorrow after this life. And see what you're putting forth. Remember the example of the furniture? What are you're going to this house. You know you're going to this house. Nobody can deny that you're going to this house. Furnish it. Furnish it. You know you're going to live there. So set things for, like send provision so that when you get there, you're not starving, right? You want to furnish that place. You want to stock up the fridge because you know you're going there. You guys, it's a certainty. Nobody can deny it. We're all going to die. We're all going to go there. So set it up so that when you get there, you have something to live with, right? So here Allah is saying, out of His mercy, reminding us to look at what we've put forth for tomorrow. وَلْتَنْظُرْ نَفْسٌ مَا قَدَّمَتْ لِغَدٍ وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ. Allah again says in the end of the ayah, He again advises us to have taqwa of Allah. He begins the ayah with taqwa, ends the ayah with taqwa, and in the middle He talks about what are we putting forth for tomorrow. Look at what you're setting forth for tomorrow. Hey, Assalamu alaikum.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. The topic today that I wanted to speak about, so I was asked and I requested this topic, and the topic was keeping the heart alive. That's the title that I wanted to work with. So the first question that we have to ask is, why is it even important to keep the heart alive? What's so important about our heart? The Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, what's translated as, in the body there's a lump of flesh, and if that lump of flesh is set right, then the entire body is set right. And if that lump of flesh is corrupted, then the entire body is corrupted. And verily it is the heart. It is the qalb. So here the Prophet ﷺ is explaining the importance of the condition of this particular part of us, of ourself, which is our qalb, our heart, the condition of our heart. In another place in the Quran, Ibrahim alayhi salam, in his dua, he's making a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in his dua, he mentions, he asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for something on the Day of Judgment, and he describes the Day of Judgment as يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. That it's the day when nothing will help a person, nothing will avail a person or benefit a person from not wealth, not children, except the person who comes to Allah with a heart that is salim, with a heart that is sound. The question we have to ask then is, what is a heart that is salim? What is qalbun salim? What does it mean? And how do we attain it? Now, in terms of talking about what does it mean? What is a heart that's salim? What does it mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying through the words of Ibrahim alayhi salam that nothing is going to benefit us on the Day of Judgment except that the only one who's going to be successful on the Day of Judgment is the one who has this thing, which is a qalb salim. So it's pretty important for us to understand what that is and how to attain it. Now, when we describe a qalb salim, a qalb that is salim, a qalb that is sound, a qalb that is healthy, a heart that is healthy, is one that is free from any defect. Defect here means diseases. diseases that take over the heart at times. And basically, the worst disease that can take over a heart is any form of shirk. Shirk here, shirk means literally, it's to associate something with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we know, all of us know what major shirk is, right? This is when we pray to worship a statue or make dua to someone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a son, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a partner, an equal. These are huge acts of shirk. And we know, all of us are, Muslim, we all know that this is something that we would never do. And this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is the greatest sin. But there are other forms of shirk which are much more subtle. There is shirk in our love, for example. When we love something else as we should only love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's a form of shirk. But it's shirk, it's associating or putting something equal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our hearts. And sometimes we do that. And even Muslims and even believers do that. At times when things are so beloved to us, and here's where it becomes complicated. That a lot of times these things, which we'll say are forms or are objects of attachment, these things are within the halal. That's why they become very, very difficult to notice in ourselves. Because these things are buried within the halal. What do I mean? Well, let me tell you this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, He lists a number of things, one after the other, and says, if these things are more beloved to you than Allah and His Messenger, and striving in His cause, then wait for Allah to bring about His decision. So it's like it's almost a very frightening threat. Because if you're talking to a child and you really want to scare that child, what do you say? If you do this and this, you're going to see, right? You're going to see what happens. If you give them a consequence, it's like not as scary as you're going to see, kind of, right? In this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, just wait to see until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings about His decision. You know that if you do this, it is there's consequences in this life before the next. So now the question is, what are these things? What are these things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that if you love them more than Allah and His Messenger and striving in His cause, that this will happen? Well, among these things are your children, your spouses, your business, your job, halal job, your homes, the things that your fathers, so your parents. Now, all of these things, there's something in common about all of these things. All of these things are halal. Every single one of these is halal. So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning us that if we love these things, which are all halal, more than Allah and His Messenger and striving in His cause, that we're going to suffer as a result of that. Now, no one comes and says, you know what, I love my spouse more than Allah, or I love my parents more than Allah. Hopefully, right? No Muslim's going to say that with their tongue. I love my children more than Allah. But we say this with our actions.